Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Rieser. How do we find ways of connecting to that which is sacred to us? And how do we discern between true spiritual insight and wishful thinking? Discussing these questions with me today is a returning guest and friend of the podcast, philosopher Per Ingvar Haukeland.
The Quakers speak of the inner light as that light which enlightens us. It gives us clarity so that we can see what is in tune with our deeper self and what is not. What is up to us really is to try to work on the discernment. What belongs to that deeper attunement and what is simply a wishful thinking.
Per Ingvar is an eco-philosopher and professor at the University of Southeast Norway. In this conversation, Per Ingvar takes us on a journey, beginning with his deep experiences of sacred connection to the trees and forests of his childhood. As an adult, he traveled far and wide in his search for practices and words that could make sense of his experiences, ultimately finding that the answers were waiting for him at home. We spoke at Per Ingvar's house in Telemark in December of last year, with the snap and crackle of the fireplace in the background. So it's nice to be sitting down for another conversation with you, Per Ingvar.
Same. Yes. Great, Ingrid.
And in between, the podcasts that we recorded, it's been wonderful to keep having these conversations because I think it always takes us to unexpected places. Mm. So I'm thinking that one thing that would be really interesting to explore with you today is, it's a little bit about how we can begin to shift our relationship to the more than human or to nature, which is also related to this question of how we find roads into the sacred or exploring our experience of the sacred. And it's interesting because it's things that are sort of, it's hard to talk about because the words that we might use are so often have these different connotations connected to them. Yeah. But I think we should try anyway. Yeah. But I was thinking that I'm wondering if did you want to share a little bit about perhaps, a bit about your own journey. Mm-hmm. Yeah, with exploring that. That would be great. Yeah. It's a place to start.
Yeah, it's a great place. We can explore it together. Because on the one hand, it's the understanding of what do we mean by sacred in a way. And I think in the retrospect, I can say that many of my experiences as a child would be experiences of something sacred, but not knowing what that was at that time. I had no language, no words to describe it. But if we today think of the sacred as something that connects us to something bigger in some way, something larger, something greater that we see as deeply meaningful and also something that generates respect, reverence, awe, that kind of feeling is certainly something I had as a child when in contact with more than human world. Simply trees especially, I think was very sacred for me in some sense because it had this direct contact. It's almost like you could speak their language, or we spoke on some common language, and that was very strange, of course. And but it is something we explored earlier. When it comes to the forests and the way we can engage with the spirits of the forest. And my daughter, she climbed the forest as a child, climbed trees as a child and talking to the spirits of the trees. I think it's very natural for many children to have these moments of, we could call it sacred dialogue or conversation with other than humans in the spirit world. And after a while, at least in my experience in coming to school, I realized that was not we shouldn't talk about. It was something we should be quiet about, these kinds of experiences. And people would ridicule them if you spoke in a way that trees could speak to you, or so that's. But the child has this very natural. They pick up stones and they can pick up sticks and they speak to them and they are alive in some ways. It's a very animistic way of being in that past history, and I thought that was something that was there in my experience in my as a child. But then later I was exploring, coming to adulthood and so on, exploring what that entailed and how important those moments, but also that kind of experiences and those kinds of experiences were for how I understand myself in relationship to these greater powers in nature. And I think that's something I've spent a lot of time exploring and something we can come back to. But how was it for you when you, what would you consider sacred in your experience?
I think that I resonate with what you were saying about it being about connecting to, for me, I think sacred experiences have a certain depth to them, in the sense that you are connecting to perhaps different layers of existence or reality. And so I think that, we could call it connecting to something greater than ourselves, but on the other hand, we're also doing that all the time. Perhaps we're not noticing it so much, but maybe we, for you, for example, when you say that your daughter was, and you yourself were speaking to the trees or connecting to the spirit world, what does that really mean for you?
Well, first of all, it recognized that the other than humans were persons in some ways. They were alive. They were personalities. And very interesting how the trees are very different personalities, how the stones are very different personalities, and the creeks and so on. And it was quite interesting because it's like exploring a whole community of individuals, persons that had so much exciting in their lives, and it was quite lively to be able to find a way to communicate and to be with that broader community. And I think that when I say that you have sacred experiences as kind of connecting to something greater, it is that connection is already there. So it's not like we're becoming awakened or aware of the connections there. And that we can see ourselves as some kind of, in the Western culture, we have a tendency to see the individual as indivisible or something like that is divided and stands alone as an island in the world. Whereas in many indigenous cultures, this is more extended family. So trees and creeks and other are relatives in some ways with extended families or extended communities. So what you are seeing also in the field of eco-philosophy is that you see yourself as an ecological self, or some self that extends into that greaterness. And that is a kind of language that you can talk about those moments or experiences of sacredness in as childhood. It's really you coming to yourself as an ecological being, or you're coming to yourself as a part of this greater web of life, and that this web of life is not just physical in some sense, but there is a spiritual side to it. There is a personal side to it. There's an animistic side that makes you be able to come into a dialogue, like a personal conversation almost with the others. And that's such rich, it's incredible rich, and it's always been that for me ever since child. childhood.
Do you feel it? I think one thing is interesting is seeing how our bodies can be attuned or not to that, because I think that for me, as I've tried to open myself more up to that ecological attunement, or in the sense that you were speaking about it just now, I felt that I could start to notice anyway more, it could be very subtle sort of changes or sensations in the body. It can be, just either a sense of peace, or even, these sort of subtle shivers down your spine, not the bad kind, but the good kind, that sort of indicates something to you, and it's kind of like these breadcrumbs that you can begin to follow.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's sort of, so for me, it's a conversation, but it's on a much more subtle level, and something that I've really had to practice, because it hasn't been, I don't think it was like that for me as a child. I was already an overthinker as a child.
Yeah, I think.
But I think it's interesting then, because I think that for me also, I've always questioned my experiences of, like, for example, I remember one time I was out running, and then and it was just the beginning of winter, and there were these light snowflakes that started to fall, and they were just dancing in the sunlight. And they seemed so joyous. They were just emanating this joy. Yeah. And then I thought, well, that's just me projecting. I must be feeling joyous.
Well, that's where you're in the mind, or in the thinking.
Yes,
abstract,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but you've never had these you've never questioned your these experiences as that it's anthropomorphizing, or that you're projecting onto this.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, it's very often you ask the question, where do these images or these sensations come from, and is it just from something you wish, or is it something from the other, or is it something we create in between? I think it's perhaps the latter. That's something that we create together. But I think that this language that we are speaking with it's not a language of you could say it's not a language of words, but it's a language of meaning of and I would say image. Because it's something that stands clear in your mind. And so when you have shivers down your spine, or when you have this sensation of joy or something, it becomes clear it's joy or it's shivers. It's something embodied. So it's very tactile, this kind of conversations. But it's a very good question to ask, what does this conversation look like? Or how do you communicate with the others? And how can we make sure it's not just a projection? And there are the question of anthropomorphism versus anthropocentrism. Now that's a very important distinction, I think, because in the eco-philosophy and deep ecology movement, we speak of something like that is a very narrowly anthropocentric, is where you place the human in the center of everything. It's like everything revolves around the human needs or the human sphere. I think that's a very narrow anthropocentrism. There's a more open anthropocentrism, which is just simply stating that you view the world from your position in some ways in the world. Mm-hmm. So it's like you're centering yourself in the world. So you come from a center of being in the world, not seeing the world revolve simply around you and you are the most important, but you still center yourself in the world. So that's a more open anthropocentrism. Then the anthropomorphism is when you in the language sort of gives human form or human language to the conversation, and in that could be the mouth of the river or the arms of the trees and the face of the mountain. Now, those anthropomorphic language is something Arne Næss, the founder of deep ecology, was quite keen on. He was quite interested in these kinds of phenomena. He thought that that was a way of making sense, or a way of giving meaning, and to make it also more personal, that we, when we speak of the face of the mountain, we can actually speak of something like the face-to-face with the mountain, meeting, the face-to-face ethic of climbing or something. And it became more, I should say, understandable from the position of the human. But it doesn't mean that all kinds of conversation actually takes place in the realm of human imagery or human forms in some ways, because we are not just limited to that language. We are also, in some ways, ecological beings that can speak another kind of language as well, and that is not based on human form, but it's based maybe on a kind of attraction or distraction, a kind of something that opens something for you and something that closes. And here I think we're touching on something what people would call spiritual connections, and that in this spiritual dimension there is something moving forward, a kind of intelligence or some kind of power that gives clarity in the conversation. And the form of clarity could be that, let's say, when people go into the forest and they say, I'm troubled with a question, maybe I should quit my job and travel somewhere to this place because it seems that's where my attraction is. It's something that opens the door in that direction. Or should I go that way and this way? So it's all this, people get trouble, and then some say that I go for a walk in the forest, or I sit down by a tree or a creek, and sitting there, walking there, gives clarity in some ways. It becomes more clear to me. And then one can say, okay, is it you yourself that creates this clarity, or is it something that is occurring or emerging from in between you and the others in nature that provides this clarity? And I think that has an element to it, but I think there's a deeper side to that, which one could look at in terms of the way the web of life is connected, not only physically, but I would say spiritually, meaning with that I mean a sense of maybe hidden connection in which it is difficult for us to, it's not a cause and effect kind of connection, it's some kind of hidden relationship, more like a synchronicity. And one has a tendency to think of those kinds of experiences as Carl Jung was pointing at, as synchronistic experiences, as something happening to you. It's meaningful, but it's happening to you. Whereas I see these synchronistic experiences as you are touching onto that spiritual domain, which has an intelligence that seeks to, in a way, help us come to clarity. It helps us come to who we are, because whatever in nature, it seeks to enhance diversity. So, and diversity is important, that any one being is able to fully be who they are in some ways. And it's not like that's just one thing. It's just that to be whoever one is in one's deeper self, and to be able to explore that in the world and to what you contribute within the world is something that the world needs. So this intelligence know that and seeks to help us. So what comes to clarity is actually is the intelligence that helps us decide upon which this opening or that opening is the right thing to go into, that door or this door. But that requires a process of discernment, how you discern what is coming from what here.
Yeah, there's so many interesting threads there. Yeah. But so just to explore that a bit more. So this, in terms of having this, to give an example, sometimes when I meet somebody, I will feel like I just met them, but that I already know them. Or that, like you said, these synchronicities, meaning that things will, several things that seem like they, you'll talk to a friend, you'll think about a friend, and then they will call you up the next moment, that kind of thing. And so for you, you're saying that that's not things that happen to us, it's actually that we're getting a glimpse of this web of connections that is always working at a deeper level than the cause and effect of sort of the day-to-day 3 dimensions and time world.
Yes. And I think it's very embodied in some sense, so that in a way there are a very physical dimension to wanting us to flourish as individuals. There is because the ecology needs us in some ways to flourish. It needs the diversity, but one could speak of that as a material or a spiritual, 2 sides of the same phenomena. Because it's like there's a deeper connection to the material connections, and that we could speak of as spiritual. Some would describe it as God or the power or life or something like that. Spinoza used the term Deus sive natura, which is like God dash nature, as 2 sides to the same phenomena. But with that, he means that when he spoke of nature, it is that physical realm, that sort of material world, natural world in some ways. But when he spoke of God, is within that material natural world. It is that the spiritual dimension or domain is within the material domain in some way. So that in any being, he called it natura naturans, which is the creative nature, that it's the creativity within us that seeks all the time to create itself into becoming. So we're always in the process of creating ourselves, in the process of becoming. And that is actually what he thought of as God. And there is an inner voice or inner reason, kinds of voice of conscience or deeper conscience called ratio, which is the voice of the heart, not the mind or the intellectual mind, but the voice of the heart is the ratio, the rationality, the reason that helps guide us in that sense, how we become ourselves. And the material world is called natura naturata. And natura naturata is that which you are in any moment in your life. You are a physical being in the world, and this is what the creative process has brought you to. But you're always in the process of still being created. You're never finished. So there is a process there where you can think of there's an external power, one could call that life or God, and that power is also within us. So life is within us, of course, but Spinoza could speak of things as there's an inner God, or the God is also within. In the Quaker context, one speaks of the light within, and Spinoza was interested in the Quaker perspective because he knew Quakers in Amsterdam at the time. He worked out his philosophies, and there were Quakers coming to him and discussing matters of religion and so on. And then the Quaker, which I myself have explored over the years, the Quakers speak of the inner light as that light which enlightens us. It gives us clarity, it gives us shining kind of clarity, so that we can see what is in tune with our deeper self and what is not. So that's where the discernment comes in, and it's sort of what is up to us really is to try to work on the discernment. What belongs to that deeper attunement that you talked about, and what is simply a wishful thinking or wanting to happen. So oftentimes one can ask them, how do you sense the difference between when something is clearly from the deep within, or something seems clear from an intellectual reasoning or a logic solution of some sort. And I feel it's touching on those kinds of physical things you talked about, or embodied things.
And sensations.
Yes. So, for example, for me, it has much to do with that when I have no clarity, I sense a kind of a unease. And when clarity comes, it comes peace. So there's a peaceful feeling. You almost like feel calm. It's almost calming down. Whereas very stirred up, very, concerned. But then after, you feel, okay, it's right. You may not like what you're supposed to do, but it's the right thing. It's in tune with your deeper self and so on. And and then there are things that you envision yourself in the becoming, so you can see yourself in the future, actually, through this process of clarity. I think this is why clairvoyant, or when you become like a psychic, is when they say, well, they see things in the future. Well, they don't see things happening in the future, but they see the process of becoming. Mm. So if things are becoming in this way, well, that will then take place. So I think that's what clarity comes from, and that's the deeper connection to those greater powers, which I would, you could describe it as life or the source or God or what you'd like to do. But it always is entangled with the material and the spiritual dimension. So it's the spiritual in the material, and the God in the body, or the God in nature in God.
Mm. There's so much there. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your personal journey with that. You were mentioning before we started recording about, seeking elsewhere for answers, and then kind of coming back to search for a way forward in your own sort of background. Yeah. Perhaps we can go along that route and then try to return to those what you were just talking about based on that.
That's a good idea. I think that as I mentioned with the Quakers, I came to the Quakers as an adult, but it really was sparked by these experiences as a childhood of being part of something greater. So I didn't feel like I was simply standing outside connecting to something greater. I was that greater. That power was within me, and I felt so enriched and so empowered by that connection, or that kind of expansion, I would say. And as I came up through school, it felt like that were taken away from me, because I was searching for a language. I was categorizing things, so were taking things away from that very tactile, experiential way of being in the world, and not just standing outside looking at it and so on. So I was searching. I realized that this connection had to do with something spiritual or something religious. So I thought when I was about 14, 15 years old, I had to go to speak to the minister and the church and so on to see whether they could meet me on what I had experienced. And when I did, I remember the minister told me that there's a two regiments, it's like a Lutheran perspective. It's like there's the heaven above and then there's the earth below, and these are kind of distinct, different worlds. And so if we are doing the right thing while here on earth, we will see God in heaven and so on. It just didn't make sense at all to me, and it was quite strange, and I thought he also probably thought I, was strange in what I was talking about. I was saying, well, God must be in nature. If there's a God, there must be in that power creating things or whatever. I don't know how I put it, but he said, well, you should start with some choir. We have some youth choir in the church, and you should start there. And I went down there actually one first time, and I lasted about half an hour, even though the nice people and so on, but they were so, it was like a very limited sectarian kind of thing almost. That, and when I said, "Oh, what are we doing here?" then well, we're praising the Lord. Well, who's the Lord and where is the Lord? And then they were saying that, well, you have to believe, as the church says in some ways, and I felt that was difficult, and then they sort of excluded me in the sense of, well, if you don't believe like we do, then you are not part of the church. And then I said, well, then I'm not part of the church, and I left. And I did leave the quest in the church at that moment, and it was when I was about 14, 15, and until later when I came to the U.S. I left to the U.S. When I was just turned 19 to study. I spent many years there, and one summer I was hitchhiking. I came to Thich Nhat Hanh, actually, who was a Buddhist monk. In north of California, there was a center called Green Gulch Buddhist Center, and I was hitchhiking around, and I was coming to that center, and I met him. I didn't know who he was, but he was a fantastic person, the most peaceful, the most sort of connected that I could see. And he spoke in a beautiful manner about this experience. Like he could put into words what I experienced. And not just that, but he also provided a sense of practice, like the meditation, the silent meditations and the silent mindful walking and so on in nature, sitting with creeks and eating in a very mindful way. And so he became a tremendous important for me. And I spoke of, he spoke of this term interbeing. And that's a very interesting concept in terms of how these things are, that's what we've been talking about. This greater connection it's a form of interbeing. We are all interbeing in some ways. And that's beautifully said. So I did practice Buddhism for a while, but I felt a little alienated with the language. It wasn't really my language, and I felt that was difficult. But I kept the practice. I've kept the practice all my life, actually. I really find that very strong. But I went to search elsewhere for the language or the cultural dimension of it, that to be able to express it. And I came to search for the Native American traditions. I met several elders in Native American reservations and communities, and one of them I met was Thomas Baniakia, who was a Hopi prophet in 1989. And when I met him, I was asking him about whether I could stay there and learn from their ways and so on. And he said something very interesting, and he said that all that first he said, the white man has taken our land, and many today are searching to take our stories. But he realized, he knew I was from Norway, he knew the Sami people, but he said that everything you're searching, you will find in your own past, in your own history. And I think, oh, really? Okay. So you should go back and search into your own cultural histories and your past. And that opened the door to me that I wasn't aware of. And three things I think happen in that search coming back then. The one thing was actually realizing that my understanding of the church and the Christian traditions and so on was very, very limited. It was so dominated by the schooling and what the church schools were telling us in certain like Sunday schools or confirmation schools and so on. I had never heard of the Christian mystics. So like Hildegard of Bingen or the Beguines, who are women mystics in the Beguine countries and Benelux countries, and Jacob Böhme and Meister Eckhart. Those folks were speaking about God, nature, similar to what Spinoza were doing, and you know, they were finding a kind of practice with that sense of connection, and the last of these that I read of was George Fox, who was the first of the Quakers, who actually had some deep experiences as a young man around 23, 24, who then realized something, that the same thing I realized when I was 23, 24, same age. And he realized that, well, he says he met Jesus on the path. He was walking outside in nature. I met Thich Nhat Hanh, you know, and so on, but he met Jesus. But what was said was that you should search in your own past. Whatever you're searching, you have yourself. You don't need the book. You don't need the church. You don't need any external means in order to get to the depth of connection. You can just be quiet. You can just be silent. You can be there. Just being there, together with others being there, will open the door for that force or the life that is in between you, or they would speak of God naturally at that time, that God is within you and God is among you in those circles of silence. So Quakers were actually practicing a kind of Zen Buddhist meditation in the Christian tradition, which I had never heard about. And I thought that was quite nice, because in a way then there was something in the Western culture that I could resonate. It gave me some more understanding of what that background was. So that's one part, and I think there were two others. We may return to it, but the other part was coming to an understanding of my own cultural history. So, for example, my own grandfather, who I asked him, you know, whether he had some experiences with these personhoods in nature spirits and so on. He said he had met Huldra and met the small people. And I said, why didn't you tell me that? You know, I was so curious about it. Well, we don't speak so much about that. That's kind of like something we don't speak about in the modern. But this is, so only 2 generations back, that kind of animism was a nature religion in some ways, were still very present in our culture. And so I explore that into the Sami tradition, the Norse and the Kven, which we'll speak of some other time perhaps, but that's at least there in that Scandinavian tradition. And then the third was actually deep ecology and eco-philosophy, where I met Arne Næss in the 1990, and we became friends, and I started to collaborate with him, and he was able to put the philosophical language to what I was experiencing at the same time. I was searching to bridge the spiritual language of both Quakers and cultural histories with the nature religions, with eco-philosophical platform.
It's interesting because I think I've had a very similar sort of experience of that the religious language that was around when I was growing up. I mean, it was not so strong in my family or in my but I grew up in a small village in Norway, and the Christianity that we saw sort of through the church was of a sort of a particular kind, with a lot of wonderful people, but where it was not really, it's like you said, it was only much more recently that I have begun to understand that actually there are these hidden threads, or these hidden roots that stretch back through history, that's kind of searching for this same thing. And then it was very hard for me in the beginning to understand, or to search for it. But then once you start to pick up the thread, you can start to find these breadcrumbs that you sort of see, you recognize, they're actually trying to talk about the same thing within their context and then the language that they were sort of having at that time. Exactly. But I think yesterday we talked a little bit about the practice that you've been exploring with your, I mean, shall we call it Quaker community here? Because people maybe don't know so much about sort of they have a very particular, Quakers have developed a particular practice that's quite unique. Yeah. So you want to say a little bit about that and how you've worked with sort of developing it and making it your own, and because it also connects to what we were talking about before about discernment and these types of things.
Yeah, that's a good angle to it. Just want to mention that when we speak of Christianity and sort of, I find that a lot of people within the Christian tradition are, of course, very connected to what we're speaking about. Yeah. And I really distinguish often between what I call the churchdom and Christendom in some ways, because the church, I feel, has dogmatized or monopolized that kind of spiritual practice or life that many people in the church are really searching for in some ways or experiencing. And many, even in the Christian tradition, would say that nature is my church, or, I feel more inclined to meet God in nature in some ways. And there's no, so just to say that I'm really searching for going beyond dogma or dogmatism, or kind of this very narrow-minded way of seeing, things as just right for everyone. It's okay, it's right for you, but when you say it's right for everyone should practice just the same thing, then that's wrong. In some ways, it's something there that inhibits the exploration and the diversity of ways. And I think what Quakers were discovering is that each individual have their way, so they have their path into it, but that it seems like each path could connect somehow, so that my path into the sacred could open a door, not just for myself, but also for others in a meeting. So the way it's practiced is basically that, for example, when we are meeting in silent, we call it silent meditation or worship, or we call it room for silence in our groups and so on. And when we meet there, we basically we meet in silence, and in the silence we are not just simply meditating, but we are listening. We're searching to actively listen and to be attentive, attuned to the powers that connects in some ways, to that intelligence we spoke about earlier, that there is something that wants to help us in this process of becoming ourselves, both as persons, but also as communities. And so, for example, I could sit in a meeting and ponder something that bothers me, like gives me a sense of unease, and I cannot find clarity, and I just lay that uneasement onto the silence, and then if someone attunes in some ways to it, someone could stand up then and speak to that uneasement without themselves knowing it, but they're not speaking in tongues or anything, like articulated in some ways. It's a very sort of just shares a story maybe, and then that speaks directly to my pondering and my uneasement and gives peace and calm, gives clarity. So, for example, I came to my dogs like that because when I was doing my PhD in Berkeley, and I was very stressed because it was coming close to the big hearing and so on, and I felt really stressed, and I said, okay, I have to go up to this meeting for worship, which is a kind of meeting house of Quakers in Berkeley, and I went up there, and on my way up there, there's a small dog coming up and biting my pants, almost like wanting to drag me back, but I was late already to the meeting, so I had to rush and I had to sort of take it away in some ways, the dog, push it away. And as I come into the meeting, we sit in silence, and there's about 40, 50 people sitting there, and I'm just thinking about my PhD, my dissertation. I'm just thinking, I cannot focus. I'm not present. I'm thinking about this. And then this woman stands up after a long silence, and she says, I don't know why I was going to share this, but I was just keep getting this image of the dog that we just got. It's a small dog, and I have in my life been very stressed at work and so on. And when we got this dog, and we have to go to walk with the dog all the time, it is almost like it's a reminder. It helps us becoming more present. And I'm thinking, oh yeah. And at that time, I was actually writing a dissertation where I was speaking about presence, not being present. And here the dog comes trying to make me present, and I just, right there, it became so clear that dog came up and really was a message wanting me to slow down, be present, breathe, and, take it easy and play with me, and it will be good. You can. And so I actually went out of the meeting before it was ended, and I searching for this dog. I never found it. It was in Berkeley. And a year after, I was working in a folk high school in Norway, in Telemark, and I was talking about dogs because with a very friend of mine said, well, you look like a dog person, and we there's a friend of mine who has now 9 puppies, and maybe we should go up and have a look, and maybe you would fall for some of them. And so we went up there, and it was a kind of evening, and it was dusk, and the guy came out with 2 adult dogs and 9 puppies, which was very small, running, coming out of the forest and running, sort of everywhere. Those were really playful. But one dog came right up to me and up to my leg, and I recognized the dog. It was the dog I had seen a year before. And he just stood there. And he was very surprised. The owner, he said, oh, that dog is really liking you, probably is connected to you. And as all the dogs were flying around, this dog just kept on wanting to climb onto me and lick my face and so on. And that dog came with me that evening, and became 13 years. So the best friend, and also the good connector, or like a helper in presencing. So, and this is the 3rd generation of dogs I have now, which is the similar, helping me. They're helping me, in so many ways. So that's a way how these kinds of meeting can occur, is that almost like there is some intelligence wanting to help you in some ways, but it's not always that you can come to the clarity yourself. So what the Quaker experience is that when we sit together and we all become attuned, then some other can pick up on the message and then share that in some ways, and that could then help generate clarity for the other. But if you go deeper into what is actually happening, there is some aspects to what's going on. One is that you have to open oneself in some ways. There's a process of opening, because many of us are so in our minds, like with me with this dissertation, always just in my head thinking about stuff. And so I'm not really present. I'm not really open to the message, because the messages are clearly there. It's just trying to even physically hold you back, like the dog did. But you are so in your mind that you don't even, push that away. You're not really present to that at all. So a process of opening takes place. And I think that really Thich Nhat Hanh's exercises of mindfulness and breathing and so on is helping us open. And many people find very that in itself is very well-being. It's a very gives a sense of well-being. But really, in the Quaker context, it is simply opening yourself to become a better listener. Because that's the second, is that you have to sort of listen. So that's the listening part. So when we are sitting in silence, I'm not just meditating or breathing, in order to just simply be present or practicing my presence, but I'm practicing attunement and listening, because I'm listening to the power in between that is wanting to express maybe something that needs to be done or needs to be said that can open doors.
Do you feel that it's, when you're several people doing it together, do you feel that it sort of increases the possibility that you can listen better together than when you're alone? Or is it just different?
Yeah, I think it's actually almost, I found it to be sometime essential to be together.
Yeah, you create kind of a field.
You create something field there.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like when you're together, you come deeper. There's a when you listen together, that's what we call like concerted silence, when the silence becomes so deep that it's almost like you can sense that the whole community listens as one organism almost. It's really very, very interesting. And I've experienced that in London with in England with the Quakers, with a group of 1,000 people in a room, listening, silent, 1,000 people, and also people standing up and speaking. When you speak then, you speak from a deeper source. You don't speak lightly in some ways. It's a very, to stand up with 1,000 people around to speak something, it's quite, so there is a process of discernment that is taking place before you actually speak, because there is, when you get a sense of, like this woman said, I want to share something with my dog, but I talked to her afterwards, and I met her dog and so on, and she said, well, I felt not easy to speak about my dog. It seemed like it was a selfish kind of thing. Why should I speak about my dog? But the dog image came in again and again. I just didn't give me any peace of mind. I had to sort of say, at the moment I spoke, the peace came. I became totally calm, and the peace came, and I sat down and I felt really peace. I don't know who this was for or what it was, but it got somewhere, and I said, well, it got right to me. And I think that's but there is a process of discernment. It's like, where does this...
Because the idea, just to clarify, the idea is that unless you're really called to, or feel called to actually say something, then you just stay silent, correct? That so that if you really feel moved to say something, if something comes to you in that listening, then you share it. Yeah. And so, yes, like you said, and I guess that's maybe, then there's that question of discernment. That was kind of what we talked about at the beginning as well. If you have an experience in nature as well or something, is this... am I hearing this correctly, so to speak? Am I hearing this correctly, or is this something that I want to hear? Yes,
that's a very good thing. So the discernment is trying to figure out more of what is coming from, where is things coming from? Is it from me, or is it from my wishful thinking, or is it from what I've learned, something I've prepared or something? So it is, discernment is to, in a way, distinguish between what is from what. And after a while, you will realize what it feels like when it doesn't come just simply from your intellect, but it comes from the source of connecting powers. And the way it feels is like oftentimes it is coming as a surprise, almost spontaneously. Why should I speak about that? Or so it's nothing prepared, and it gives you an unease. It's almost like you start shaking because the heart beats very rapidly, and physically I can start shaking, and that's what they call Quakers, because the judge was saying, well, you look like Quakers when you're. Well, it's because when you are moved in some ways, you're moved, you start quaking or shaking. And it's before, I think in the 1600s, it was more, maybe more physically. But today, I think many people have the same sensation, but they take it a little more restrictive. And they have it, the inside, so their heart is beating really fast. And when I've done stand up and speak, for example, and sit down, it just calms down back to basic pulse in a second. It's almost like, boom, that's right away. So you are basically, you can feel whether whether this is something that comes from a deeper source through certain physical kind of sensations, like you pointed out with the shivers down the spine. There's some kind of sensation in the body, like this shivering of the heart, and so those kinds of things help you discern. But when you discern, that's one thing, is coming to clarity. Okay, I know I have to share this story about the dog, for example, the woman, but to actually follow that discernment, to follow what it leads, to stand up and say something is a huge step. There's so many people who come to sit with clarity in some ways. Oh yeah, okay, it's coming from the source, but they don't feel confident enough to stand up and speak, because that's when their personal kind of things can come in, and they feel like, oh, I'm not how should I phrase this? Oh, it's going to be difficult. And that's why after discernment, it's a sense of commitment to act upon what you see. So there's a sense of a quest to express what comes to clarity, either by standing up in the meeting, or by quitting your job and doing what you feel is opening for you, become clear for you, and that by doing it. So that's why we call those kinds of doings, in the old language, for testimonies, almost like your testimony to simplicity, your testimony to fellowship, and testimony to equality and certain things. But it's like doing it. So it's not just seeing it or thinking it, but it is doing the doing part. And I think that's why, Quakers are, they were, of course, not of course, but they were pacifists from this ongoing, because that's what feels to be doing what you see clearly, was the message of peace. And the same in terms of equality. So they fought against slavery, also the first to fight against that and work, well, one of the first, and abolitionists and so on, and of course, like later Greenpeace and Amnesty, and were influenced by Quaker and Quaker ways of doing stuff. So, for example, in the Amnesty International, we see the barbed wire around the light. That's what, for Quakers, they would call the inner light. The light within is that which gives clarity of peace, love, and connection in some ways. And the barbed wire is what inhibits that then. It's what injustices and disequalities, war, violence, all of that. So there are forces who seeks to break things down, and there's forces to build things up, which are both social and cultural, but also natural forces. There are forces in us who breaks our body down, breaks spirits down, and so on. But so the balance between the dark and the light is always there. And Carl Jung was depth psychologist who had much fondness to say about Quakers, but he said you should be more concerned about the shadows, not just the inner light, but the inner shadows and so on. And I think many of us have, as Quakers, also have taken that up. But what I realized is that this form of sitting in a meeting could potentially be also another form where the form becomes in the way of the content. It's like this, okay, we're sitting here and we just do stuff. We are not really attuned necessarily. So the forms of the meeting can be restrictive, especially if you sit in certain houses, I think. So I found that sitting out in nature was a much more responsive kind of, we became deeper into a living silence in sitting silent in nature. And then we realized something else, which I've realized individually, and that is that other beings come into the silence. So, for example, in one silence, we had like a squirrel come in and sat next to us in a circle, and it sat very silent, totally in silence, just next to us as we were sitting. There's one space in the circle, and the squirrel just came there and sat there, and suddenly it's almost like the squirrel gave clarity to the meetings, and the trees around, the fire in the middle, and so we realized that like what Spinoza was saying is that there is a creative force, that God is in all beings, not just in humans, of course, it's any being. So any being can actually stand up and speak to you if you listen. So sometimes it's easier for me to find clarity in meeting with other than human beings. For example, a creek, or the sound of the creek, or the wind, or a tree, or a stone, or birds. Especially birds for me has been very enlightening and helping me come to clarity, give light on some issue. So these things then could be called a kind of earthquaker, I guess. But it's but at least a focus on this earth connection, or this connection to the land and earth.
Yeah. Well, so I'm thinking about what you're saying about the intelligence, or the force, or God that is wanting to help us come to clarity.
Yeah.
Or you said something wants us to become ourselves.
Yes.
And because I think that some people might say, well, if if we want to call, instead of saying God, we could say nature. I know that's not what really Spinoza is saying, but people might say, well, they don't feel comfortable with the idea of God. They would rather just think of nature, and a nature that is alive in a perhaps more fundamental way than what many people tend to think.
Yes.
But I'm thinking there's something else here, because there's something about that living force that wants us to come to clarity, to become who we are. And perhaps it's something to do with that the universe also loves to explore and to create in all kinds of ways.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if we could go back to what you were saying about diversity. So because that was not quite you were saying that the reason that this force desires diversity.
Yes.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's in some ways it's quite obvious, I think, when it comes to, for example, if you take an ecosystem or a natural system, the more diverse the system is, the healthier, the resilient it is. The more monocultural, or the more one way. If you have like a forest and there's planted trees and there's only one type of tree with one same age, if that is attacked by a pest or something like the bark beetle, or that could take out the whole forest. But if there is a diversity of trees in the forest, that would create a much stronger, resilient forest. And so, but there is that dimension. It's very ecological in some sense, but there is that other dimension, which is like when we think differently in some ways, or when we are expressing different things, there are showing the human or the whatever being's potential. So, for example, like you were saying, and it's almost like if you think of the intelligence, like, well, what can the human being do? Well, let's see. And then you create as much diversity as possible, and it creates like cultural diversities, and it creates all these rich ways of being in the world. So I'm like, oh wow, that's amazing how rich it is. Arne Næss, used to say that when everyone thinks the same, there's not much thought at all, because it's too limited. So this diversity helps us come deeper into connection with this greater web of life that we all belong to. So this could be potentially an argument for celebrating difference, and celebrating diversity is celebrating difference and otherness. And I do that. I celebrate difference, diversity, and otherness. But at the same time, I celebrate that which connects. There's no, for me, there is no opposite there.
No.
It's like we are all, life is one and many at the same time. Life could not be just one thing. Life needs the diversity to flourish. And so it is with your life and with my life and the human being's life and in any being's life. It's like it needs that diversity of relations into the world, also to become itself as one soul or one being, one life. So,
because it's like we need the diversity, but then at the same time we have to do this discernment that is also about what is in service to life.
Yes.
And because it's like you say, there are forces that are in service to life, and then the forces that break that down. And so it's not like, well, all kinds of difference is good.
No. Well, there is no. It's like one could say that difference in itself is just how things are, because a life is different in some way. So that's just what it is. But it is when we abstract that kind of difference or oneness into a language, especially in a cultural framework where we are saying something is good or bad or something is in or out, that kind of language creates polarizations. It creates a kind of misled pluralism or relativism with misled monotheism or sort of monoculturalism. That sort of both of those directions, which are often seen as us-them kind of polarization, which we see so much in the world today, actually is not what I'm speaking of in terms of that honoring the diversity and difference, but it's also seeing how that diversity, just as you said, is contributing to that which strengthens the life as a whole, but also what contributes to the flourishing of that diversity. So mostly in this narrow sense, I think for many, when it comes into an either or, us them kind of rhetoric or polemic, then it is wanting them to be like us, or you demonize the other and you search to have power over the other and to control the other in some ways, and that's so much different than how life unfolds. But for many who with a sort of that kind of eye would see like a wolf going after a reindeer as exerting power over the reindeer. But that's not the case. It's like totally misleading that oneness which is happening in the relationship between the wolf and the reindeer too. And so that's a complexity there that I think we have, that we often oversee when we simplify or reduce things into individuals separate from others. We don't see how things are unfolding, becoming into like a community or as a web of relations. So the wolf and the reindeer is so intricately and intra-personally related that that kind of act of hunting, one could almost see it as a gifting, because it's almost like the reindeer can give itself to the wolf for the sense of the flourishment of the flock. So the relationship between that is complex, of course, but it is certainly worth exploring a little more. This kind of relationships.
Well, so in terms of how we do this this navigating, because I think that was really has been so useful in what we've talked about now, where you talked about the Quaker practice of discerning what comes to you and so on. And then something that you mentioned earlier in the conversation was this thing about feeling what attracts us and what repels us.
Yes.
And I know that, I'm not sure if you mentioned it in the context of Spinoza, but I think that he talks about these affects, right? And like we have these things that we are drawn to. And I think this is also another discernment challenge, is like, all right, understanding or discerning, am I drawn to this? Is it my deepest calling to be drawn to this project, these people, this place? Or are there other things that are, what is it that I'm listening to when I'm hearing this being said, sort of?
Yes. No, that makes sense. And I think that it's a really good question. I think that this relationship between attraction, distraction, or expulsion in some ways are very natural. It's almost like it's just in our being. There's a philosopher, biologist, anthropologist called Gregory Bateson, who wrote a book called The Steps of an Ecology of Mind, where he believes that the mind is in the system, it's in the material, it's in between you and the world. So the mind is not in your brain or head, but it's in between.
Right.
And what he says is that which is in between are differences. And what makes sense or what gives meaning is a difference that makes a difference. This is what his definition of that. And in my view, it's that it's a very emotional response to the world, not just an intellectual analysis of the world, what makes difference. It's almost like if you turn your head towards the sun, to feel the warmth in your face, that kind of almost it follows, naturally inclined almost to follow the sun. Like I always feel drawn to the sun areas because we live in a land where a lot of dark, so we feel drawn to the sun areas. I could just feel my whole body, my soul, everything is just drawn to the light in some ways like that. But other time when it's too much in the summer, there's 24-hour daylight, and then you are drawn to the dark and the shade. And so you're living in that kind of balance between taking attraction in and an expulsion or distraction coming out of. So it's very embodied. And that's why I think what Spinoza is getting at also when he speaks of these emotions, because some emotions may actually be what he call active emotions, are emotions that activate the whole being. But those emotions, he describes it maybe a little bit in ways that seems maybe a little binary in some ways. He says there's like active emotions are positive in the sense that they generate or activate the whole of yourself, whereas passive emotion, they passivize your whole self. So you're not fully present in all of that. So let's say he could use examples like hate or discouragement or something like that, or indifference as something that doesn't really fully engage the whole soul or the whole self. Whereas love, friendship could be emotions that activate the whole self. So he feels that when you are in the emotional stage of hate or indifference, there are something in you, which is that inner light, that ratio, who seeks to help you. That's back into how the intelligence works, is that seeks to help you transform something negative into a positive, or something passive into an active emotion. And that creates a sort of emotional maturity that helps you closer to yourself. So if you take that into the context of difference, and what makes a difference is that when you respond, should I go to the right or should I go to the left? There's something in between that awakens, emerging that opening or closing the door. And when something opens and you see it opening, then that makes a difference. So you act upon that. It's something that is meaningful. It gives clarity. And that could be then activating the active emotion. So it's something you seek out. Whereas passive emotion wouldn't really it will be trying to withdraw from it or trying to. So hate is something you don't want to do what you hate, or something you want to get away from it in some ways. Whereas what you love is something you want to do. You want to actively search that person out or something. Someone you hate, you want to avoid sometime. But there is in the sense of difference, it could be that what opens the door is something that causes pain or suffering in some ways, or risk. There's a risk involved. So, for example, quitting your job gives you maybe risk of losing an income, a steady income. It puts you out there at risk, but that is where life is lived. It's lived in the spontaneity. That's where these forces come the strongest towards you in some ways and helps you. Whereas in the institutions, in the social institutions we are so embedded in, including workplaces and so on, it is often harder to encounter these openings and closings because everything is very set into its schematic world, but of course it's also to be found there, but it's not fully. It's harder to act and respond or correspond in some ways to that which emerges in the field of you being in the world, and something makes a difference. So it's a good question how that kind of is very embodied. It's not very intellectual in the sense of analysis. It's just have to be very attentive to how you respond to the world. What does it feel when something opens and something closes? And that's like a discernment.
I mean, if you're in love with somebody, you feel extremely drawn to them. So, but then it can be so overpowering. But I guess that we can practice that same. It's like you said. It's like turning your face to the sun.
Yeah.
It is actually perhaps that natural for us. It's just that we have other things that get in the way, or like you said, habits or institutions that maybe block the possibilities for those openings.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I do think that there are in our being, there is something, I think this is not just relative to the individual. I think there is something that is also shared in some ways, is that that there's something that seems good in some ways, or seems, like you said, with contributing to the health and the flourishment of ecosystems. It's something that senses to be right, or something. It's bringing ethics into it, but not an ethics of very strong kind of codes or principle or rules, but rather an ethic of attunement, an ethic of being attentive and attuned to the world about how differences play out and so on. I think that's what.
And then maybe if we are attuned, then our actions will more naturally flow in alignment with that greater ecology and the greater intelligence.
And that's what Arne Næss called beautiful actions, because he distinguished between moral actions and beautiful actions, where Immanuel Kant said, he actually made a distinction like this. Immanuel Kant said that there are moral actions, it's actions you do in spite of your inclinations, like natural inclinations. So, for example, if you're on the bus and an older lady come in, so you give you want to sit yourself, you're tired, but you give the seat because it's your moral obligation to the old lady. Whereas you don't really want to, but you do it out of obligation. So that's what he thought was the best. And then the other one is when you have beautiful actions, he says, well, it's actions when you act according to natural inclination. You give the seat, and you also really want to give the seat. It's something deeply right. It feels really good. But according to Kant, he said that you cannot rely on these kind of beautiful actions. It's too relative in some ways. You have to work on the sort of system of moral obligations and so on. Whereas Arne Næss, he wrote a beautiful piece about beautiful actions, where he said, well, let's not forget these beautiful actions, because those are actions out of natural inclinations, and it's like this ethics flow naturally in some ways.
They're much more reliable, you could say.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Spinoza's book, where he lays this all out, is called Ethics. Yeah, so this is another kind of ethics than the Kantian ethics in that sense.
I just want to ask you, as we're sort of coming to a close here, I wanted to ask you about, is there anything that you would like to share with people or to suggest for people if they want to get to this ecological attunement, or how do we start to listen?
Yeah.
Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think again, this word attunement that you brought forth in the beginning here is a very good one, because it is attuning oneself to the world one lives in, that life world, where you become more attentive to the animals, what's going on with the insects, the trees, and everything that is happening in your place where you are in the world. And you're attuning yourself to it, and you're seeing what is it that breaks things down, or what is it that helps make things flourish, and how can I be present and participant in making life flourish where I live. And so that could be then coming together and reskilling ourselves, which is one aspect. That could be reskilling ourselves in doing a kind of nature-friendly gardening or food production in some ways. It could be more connected to how we use the forests in a more qualitative and very selective way, rather than just clear cutting and all kind of this quantitative thinking. So it's attunement. I think being attentive, paying attention, really, really paying attention to where we are and where we live, and how we are able to participate and reciprocate these powers of flourishing, instead of diminishing and withering life around us. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't. It's very personal, like I think you mentioned. It's very personal, but I think there's an element of community. It has to have some kind of community in this. And I think just the small things you also said about maybe some rituals we do in the seasons, turning of seasons, or the transition from one season to another, paying attention to things like that, or even just the culture of thankfulness, of gratefulness. I think just when you start practicing gratefulness, or you're actually finding a place where the soil gives you food, or your garden. So, sometimes put something back to the soil that the soil wants, that the soil makes the soil flourish, and compost or whatever, you bring that back into the flourishing of life, and to give thanks in the process. It alters your relationship to that other. And the same thing, another way of doing it is to speak differently. So you're trying to, instead of speaking about nature or the other as that creek or something, you're speaking to it. You're speaking with it in some ways, and honoring it. Oh, you are so beautiful today. You sound so, or you sound sad, or you sound strong today, or having a conversation with the other than humans, and engaging with them in a correspondence, or what Tim Ingold called correspondence, but a kind of dialogue where you go back and forth. It's a very powerful way of shifting perspective from you standing before a world of objects to you standing in a community of all beings.
Great. I think that's a nice note to end on.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for taking time to have this chat.
Wow. Likewise. It's really, really been wonderful to speak to you, as always. Very nice.
And then we look forward to next time.
Yeah.
You'll find links to the things we talked about in the show notes, including links to my previous conversations with Per Ingvar. In this week's newsletter, I tell the story of how Per Ingvar and I met. And if you enjoy hearing about the background behind these conversations and would like to stay up to date on new episodes, essays, and events, sign up for the free newsletter at forestofthought.substack.com. You can also provide deeply appreciated support for the show via Patreon or Substack. All the info is in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.